proceed.
All right, that's wonderful. Thank you very much, Ali, for the introduction. And hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you to discuss this topic on what is called achieving market leadership in ecosystems. As Ali has said, I should be talking for roughly 30 to 35 minutes, something like that, and would look forward to answering questions if these arise, of course. In half an hour, I can only give an appetizer of the topic, and I hope it's a good appetizer, of course, that I then also have the pleasure of seeing you and working with you during the workshop. Let's just take a look at some of the things that we're going to discuss here. There is a lot of talk about ecosystems. There has also been a lot of talk, and there is still a lot of talk about supply chains when we do strategy analysis. First, I'm going to make a couple of points regarding what's new. You know, why do we talk about ecosystems, and what's so different with supply chains? So that's going to be the first topic of discussion. It's going to be quite brief, I think. The second thing is, when we look at getting leadership in those new ecosystems, as we call them, there is something called critical mass, which is pretty important. And many people like to talk about critical mass, and many companies want to have critical mass. I've never heard anybody say, I want uncritical mass. It's like a good thing to have. What exactly do we mean by this? And if you want to have it, third point then is, how do you reach this? And how do you know it's robust, meaning that if you get this leadership, that you're going to be maintained on top of the ecosystem. So that's the issue of robustness. So 4 topics on the agenda. For some, of course, I'm going to say, well, we're going to have a lot more time during the workshop to talk about that. But so first, what exactly do we mean by supply chains and ecosystems, or in other words, what's new, really? And when we do strategy analysis of companies in either sports goods or in the car industry or petrochemicals or financial services, whatnot, the classic approach has been to try to figure out how the system is hanging together. And so we used to call this, and we still call this, a supply chain. And so here you see on this graph, you see an illustration of the supply chain in the sports goods industry. And it is drawn from the point of view of players like Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, who are, you know, selling apparel and shoes through distribution channels to the end customer. So what we try to do is we try to figure out, how does that work, you know, and how does everybody make money? And we typically start from the right-hand side, from us customers. You know, we want to buy a shirt or shoes, so to whom do we go? We go through either specialists like, for instance, in the US, the Sports Authority, or a generalist like Walmart, or we buy online directly from companies like Under Armour. Now, typically, those guys don't even make their things. They subcontract the making of T-shirts to players like United Knitting, the so-called manufacturers. And these guys, of course, only do the knitting. They buy fibers from all kinds of players like spandex, and of course the chain continues all the way to the petrochemical suppliers. So here we try to portray the system, and it looks pretty linear, and that's why we call it a chain of activities. And so we try to figure out who has the power in the supply chain, who really has the value added, who is making money. And why is that? And when we take our crystal ball out, we're trying to figure out, this is 2013, how is this going to look like in, for instance, 2018? And to do this, we do all kinds of analysis, and I'm sure that some of you are familiar with that. But for instance, when we look at players like spandex up in the supply chain, so they have a brand. So question we typically ask us, well, are they going to really be profitable? Are they going to remain profitable? Are they going to become more profitable? Should we be integrating into the development of raw materials, for instance? And some of the analysis that we do is, well, we look at alternatives to, for instance, spandex. And when we do this, we see, oh, there are a lot of alternatives. In other words, you have lots of players that came into this part of the supply chain. There are many substitutes. And so what does it typically mean? Well, probably the power and value creation of spandex is quite limited. Probably players like Nike, Adidas, if they have strong brands, they will be able to maintain their strong brands because they can play of one supplier against the other one, etc., etc. And so looking forward in the supply chain, they can probably play of the specialist against the generalist. And so when we do this analysis in a lot more detail, of course, we're going to quickly see that players like Nike, Adidas, Under Armour have and will maintain their power in the supply chain. But in general, it's a very linear analysis where we look at entry, substitution, power at the different stages of the supply chain, and where we try to see where the action is going to be in the next 5 to 10 years. This is a very linear analysis where pretty much every player can play with every other player, where the power of each player is a function of how unique they are, how good their products are, and of course how well they can reach the end consumer. This is a very simple supply chain analysis. For instance, when we look at a more complicated one like the tire industry, it's a very different story, but this is a chain drawn from the point of view of the tire manufacturers like Michelin, Hankook, and whatnot. They buy from a lot of suppliers. Then looking forward, they need to convince either Toyota or other original equipment car manufacturers to buy their tires. They need to convince CarMax or Midas and other replacement chains to buy them. They need to convince fleets. And so then, of course, each player in turn needs to convince their own customers. It could be a truck, fleet guys, it could be an individual customer. But again, if the chain is more complicated than for sports goods, the questions are going to be pretty much the same, the analysis pretty much the same. It's a very linear relationship where every player can play with every player, and where the story is, how unique is your product, how much power do you have, and do you have what it takes to be competitive in this particular chain. So that's the classic analysis of a market environment, and we still do this a lot. It has become quite sophisticated, but it turns out in some markets this is not really the way it works. And so let me just switch to some very simple ecosystems that we saw developing. And some of you may remember the good old days of the Nintendo 64 and the Game Boy, and where Nintendo was ruling the waves, where pretty much 95% of all kids in most countries were playing with a game console of Nintendo. Now, of course, the game console has no use if there is no game that is there to be played on and to be played with. And of course, this Nintendo game can only be played on a Nintendo console. And so what did we see developing? We saw developing a bunch of products very much unlike tires. So in other words, a Michelin tire can be fitted on any car. And all the car manufacturers can buy from all the tire companies. This is not the case here. We saw products coming that don't have a value by themselves. In other words, a console without a game doesn't have a value. A game without a console doesn't have a value. They gotta be sold together and used together. And of course, a Nintendo game cannot be used in a Sega console, and a Sega console cannot really accept Nintendo games. So we have value that is created by systems. And what we noticed was that the more consoles were sold of Nintendo, the more games were becoming available. And of course, the more games became available, the more everybody wanted to have that console. And the more consoles of Nintendo they were becoming available, the more games became available, etc. And so we saw a reinforcing system coming into place. Very complicated to compete against that. When Hankook wants to compete with Michelin, it is really sufficient to make a tire that is also good and to offer it to car manufacturers and the replacement market. Imagine the difficulty of Sony when they wanted to start in the mid-90s. They really truly did have a much better console than Nintendo. It was this console that was based on a CD rather than this old-fashioned cartridge, which was really slow, was really from a different decade. Here comes Sony with a console which is really razzle-dazzle, technology-wise, a lot better. But of course, a console without the games is not really doing anything. And so, although you have a much better product than Nintendo, your job is, how on earth can I really get some people to develop those games? Because without the games, the console has no value. And so Sony found itself trapped very quickly from the onset into this cycle that could easily go positive. The more consoles were sold, the more game developers are going to develop PlayStation games. And of course, the more PlayStation games, the more consoles are going to be sold. But they could also be caught into a completely different story, which was, well, if not enough consoles are being sold or bought, then of course game developers are not going to be happy to really develop those games, etc. There was another complication that was coming in, which is very different from traditional analysis, which is Nintendo had constructed its system as a closed system. They were controlling everything. You could not just be a game developer and say, I'm going to develop a game for Nintendo. No, you needed to have their permission. You needed to pay Nintendo. Very closed system. When Sony came in, they said, we cannot compete with the same closed system because nobody is going to join us. And so here we saw one of the first developments of open systems, where Sony made its specifications available, and pretty much anybody that wanted to develop a game could develop a game. And so here we saw the development, not unique, it was not the first time, but a very visible example of the battle of systems. You need a host and a complement to really create value. It could be open, it could be closed. And of course, we're not just talking about a linear system, we're talking about this set of activities that are influencing each other. Now that was a very simple story, and so we've seen since the development of very complicated stories, very complicated systems that developed. And I think all of us, we're all familiar, of course, with Google and how they got started. And it looks like Google has been with us for the past 3 decades. Well, it's only been since the early 2000s, barely 10 years ago, that Google has been with us. So they started by offering natural search, as they called it. So Google with the halo, they wanted to organize the information in the world. And so the do no evil guys had this search routine that organized the world, and we could sit behind our PCs to really find information. Beautiful, but it didn't make any money. It only started making money when Google started realizing, well, hey, if all those guys are looking for information, maybe they're looking to buy something. And so if they're really looking to buy either a car or a sports shirt or shoes or whatever it is, very likely some people out there that sell those shoes, or those cars may want to be interested to advertise on the web, in other words, on my Google site. And of course, if that is the case, I'm going to start collecting advertising, and the more money I collect, the more information I can organize. And so that was the development of this system called Google AdWords. Now, of course, the more information they organize, the more people are going to flock to them to do searches. The more people do searches, the more products are going to be found, the more products are found, etc., etc. Now, they were ingenious enough to also see that we're not only looking and going to the Google website, we may be looking on the website of CNN or the Financial Times. And if we look there and somebody's reading an article about cars, hey, why don't we organize the sidebar to the right? And so the moment somebody types in fast cars, what is going to happen? There's going to be an ad popping up organized by whom? By Google on the website of CNN. And so we have the second service that was born by Google called Google AdSense. And so what were we seeing? We're seeing a system. This has nothing to do with a linear relationship anymore, so we cannot talk about supply chains, but a system that is really reinforcing each other. And so very quickly, we saw that what happened. They were getting a head start, and players like certainly AOL, Yahoo, Ask Jeeves, and now, in spite of all the desperate efforts of Bing, they're not really getting off the ground, because obviously we see a mechanism in place that is extremely strong. Now, this system is becoming even more complicated, and competing in it has become even more complicated, and as you know, with the arrival of Androids. So with Android, what have we seen happening? Well, of course, we're not just searching on the web anymore through our PC. We're searching on the web through mobile devices. And so Google has been so smart and so fast to really come up with this open system. An open system that organizes mobile networks on our phones, on tablets, and lots of other things. And what is the thinking? Now, if we're searching on PCs with Google, probably we're going to search on our mobile devices with Google. And so here we have another loop that is coming in, the famous Google Droid connection, which makes competition in the system, of course, a lot more complicated for anybody that wants to come in. And so when you look at this picture, obviously this is so very different from Hankook selling a tire to everyone that wants to buy it. No, competing in supply chains and competing in ecosystems is very different. And so here just a couple of points why we think it's so important to recognize this difference. If you want to compete in regular industry supply chains, it boils down to what? Making better shoes, offering better banking services, coming up with unique products. And so the value of the product, of the service, is going to really be this strong head start. Second, we try to understand who really has the power. Can you capture the value? Well, if you have the power in the supply chain, chances are you will be able to capture quite a bit of value and create investor value. And then a third thing which is so important is, do you have critical scale? In other words, are you big enough? Do you have enough market share to be competitive? And so, for instance, when you look at truck manufacturing, obviously if you have only 2% market share, it's not going to work. You need to have 10 to 15% market share to really be able to be competitive. If it's in t-shirts, at 2% market share, you can be successful. In the insurance industry, the critical scale is maybe 1% of the national market. Critical scale, very different from competing in ecosystems where there you cannot just come up with a new console. No, you need to come up with an entirely new system, a host and set of complements. It's not enough to start thinking about, I'm going to position myself in the chain. No, it's all about constructing a new chain. It is all about constructing a new system which could be either open or closed? And if you do so, are you going to have what it takes? And are you going to have what it takes means, are you going to be able to get to critical mass? And so here are some very strong differences between the two market environments, supply chains or ecosystems, where critical mass is a key thing. And so in the workshop that I hope you're going to come to, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on trying to understand this distinction between the two systems and also how do you get this critical mass. I'll just give several examples right now to illustrate a little bit how seasoned competitors also have a hard time getting leadership and keeping leadership. Competing in ecosystems is a lot more demanding, and you need to understand the rules of winning a lot better. And so here on this graph here, I just show a graph from competition in online auction systems. And so in the two boxes to your left, what do you see? You see, on the one hand, traffic, indicators of traffic like eyeballs on different websites offering online auctions. eBay in black, Yahoo in dark gray, Amazon in grayish. I'm sorry, the others in just whitish. What do we see here for the US market? A lot of black. And what do we notice is that it looks like if you win, you really win in a major way, as we like to call it, the winner-take-all dynamic. Now, what is interesting is that first, the systems of Yahoo and Amazon are pretty much the same as the one from eBay. So in other words, it's not, is your product different? It is pretty much the same. And in spite of the fact that it's the same, one seems to win it all. Number one. Number two, what is equally interesting, you go to Japan and you draw that picture, and what you see is the market share of eBay is 0, and there Yahoo has it all. And what is amazing is that you have players that really are leaders that seem to understand how to become a leader in one market. You go to another geographic region, you're not able to do it again. How do you get leadership? How do you maintain leadership in your market and markets that you want to penetrate? Again, a point we're going to address in the workshop. So here, how do you transfer your learning from one geography to another one? Not obvious. Second story that some of you may be familiar with, we've gone to school on some of the best leaders and managers of ecosystems like Intel that have done fabulous in some ecosystems and have really done terrible in others. Again, how do you compete? And just two stories to illustrate here. The story of Wi-Fi, and the second one is going to be of WiMAX. And I don't need to explain what Wi-Fi is, of course, but we just go back 10 years, and we were hardly using those Wi-Fi networks. And where does it all come from? It was started by Intel that during the 90s was trying to convince the world that the fastest chip is the best chip. It was the story of Intel INSEAD, and so they were trying to make us buy computers because they were faster. As you can see to your right top, the sales of Intel in billions of dollars, going from 92 or 5 billion to 2000, over 30 billion in one decade. Amazing. On the basis of speeds, at once they hit a speed bump, and by the early 2000s, speed was no longer selling. So they thought of something else, which was saying, well, somehow if speed is no longer selling, well, we see that it's more and more possible to take your computer on the go with laptops. And so they started trying to convince the world that it's not speed, you have all the speed that you need, but what you want is mobility. And so they packed speed and mobility in the new processor called the Centrino. And then what they were trying to do is, if we can somehow create the market for mobility, if everybody is convinced that you need mobility, well then of course everybody will want to buy a laptop. Now, what kind of laptop? Well, a laptop that is Wi-Fi compatible. Now, which ones should be Wi-Fi compatible? The ones that have the Centrino. And so their idea was, if we can get this message out that you want mobility through Wi-Fi, well, then, of course, we're going to sell a lot of chips. So just imagine you have a maker of chips that is way up in the supply chain and the ecosystem that tries to reach us to come up with this new proposition. And so, as you know, obviously in the early 2000s, very few people knew what Wi-Fi was. And so Intel basically brought Wi-Fi to the world, doing what? Creating and pushing this open standards. So 802.11 as it came to be known. Associated with the Centrino brand, and then they sent their technicians around the world to whom? Hotels, hotspot operators, telecom operators, everybody, to help them organize hotspots where? In Starbucks, in McDonald's, all for free, so that when we went into a Starbucks or a McDonald's or whatever place and we opened our laptop, we could get Wi-Fi. And what was the whole point, of course? If we can use Wi-Fi everywhere, we're going to buy Centrino-based laptops, and we're going to start selling and buying those machines. And sure enough, by 2004, sales were back up. They were again riding high. So we have the two Wi-Fi signs, and it was the one to the left here, so the Wi-Fi associated with Intel that really clobbered the other Wi-Fi of what was called the Wi-Fi Alliance. By the late 2000s, they said, well, mobility is no longer selling that well, so what are we going to do? We're going to launch mobile broadband. And so they went from Wi-Fi, which is getting mobility in an area of 30 meters, to getting mobility in an area of 30 kilometers. Of course, very, very different. And so they thought of launching the Centrino 2 on the basis of the same idea. Why don't we convince the world that you need mobility in a range of 30 kilometers? In other words, 4G mobile broadband is going to be much faster. And so if you're being convinced of that, you're going to buy laptops with Centrino inside, Centrino 2 inside, and the sky is going to be the limit, and we're going to do the same thing. Unfortunately, by 2012, 2013, what have we seen? WiMAX has absolutely not worked. What has worked? It's LTE 4G of the telecom operators. They have been able to keep Intel and WiMAX at bay, and it has been a big failure. And so here we see a player, Intel, that has been able to get success twice worldwide, building different ecosystems. For the third time, tried to do it again, didn't work whatsoever. Now, what went wrong? Again, something which is very, very different in ecosystems versus in supply chains. If you look at Wi-Fi dynamics, what was Intel able to do? They were able to convince whom? Telecom operators, hotspot operators, everybody to buy into the Wi-Fi, and somehow they were able to get the incentives of all the players in this Wi-Fi alliance. And so one player was critical. It was the telecom operators, and so they were happy offering Wi-Fi, of course, because where their wire stopped, they could offer a service and sell, for instance, airports Wi-Fi services. And so Wi-Fi was for the telecom guys a complement. The cellular supply chain and Qualcomm never really liked Wi-Fi, but they didn't really have the power to stop them. Because of what? Because the powerful telecom players were sided with Wi-Fi. When WiMAX came around, what happened is that many things, but one very important thing is the strong, very strong telecom players like AT&T, France Telecom, and so many of the strong players say, whoa, whoa, hold your horses, Intel, what are you going to do? you're building a new infrastructure. You're building new masts. And so rather than complementing us, what are you going to do? You're going to make us obsolete. And so Intel was only able to convince the weak telcos. That, of course, was not very inspiring to anybody. And so the strong telcos sided with Qualcomm. And so to cut the long story short, what happened because of clashing ecosystem incentives, what happened, Intel was simply not able to sway the strong telcos, and so they really lost it completely. And so here we see another very big difference between supply chains and ecosystems. It's not just thinking about your product, about your value, about your competitive systems. You need to get everybody in the system in line. Incentives matter. It's all about coalitions. Very complicated. And so we've noticed that more and more of those battles are coming forward, very different from the classic battles. And so it's always the same thing. So as you see here on this particular chart, many from mobile phones to chips to operating systems, airline reservation systems, the classic story is most competitors are losers. And so it's very, very complicated to really compete in this battle. But if you win, it seems to be you really win it all. And of course, that's what we call monopolies, and that's what is so attractive about it. If you win, you really cash in, but it's so complicated because most people don't seem to make it. Now, what is really key in all of this, we call it the whole notion of critical mass. And so I'm just going to say a couple of words about this. And again, during the workshop, we'll have plenty of time to really go into this. But so here, I'm just going to give a little bit of the intuition and then a couple more things, and then I'll open it up for questions because I don't want to take too much of your time. But the essence of situations where we have critical mass is what? It is markets where we see customers deciding on the basis of what? I'm not just buying a game console because I like the console. I buy it because so many other people have it. I don't buy an iPad or an iPod because I find it good. No, the Galaxy is also good, but I buy it because so many other people have it. And so what we see people making decisions on the basis of what? I do something because other people do something. And translated into markets, when we say I buy something, not just because the product is good, but also because so many other people buy it, well, what's going to happen? Well, if people buy because other people buy, well, Apple is going to like that, of course, because if you're successful, you're going to get even more success, and success is going to breed success. But simultaneously, like with Bing, if nobody uses you because nobody else is using you, well, then, of course, it's going to be failure breeds failure. And in spite of the fact that the Bing search engine is just as good as the search engine of Google, of course. And what do we have? We have a set of situations where either you're going to sell a lot because you have been successful, or you're not going to sell a lot because you have not been successful. And it's the same product. And so what do we notice? We have a dynamic that is unfolding where it could flip-flop either way. And so just like we've seen with the PlayStation 1, great success. PlayStation 2, great success. PlayStation 3 doesn't really work that well. Okay, Nintendo 64, great success. Comes around with the Cube, Nintendo Cube, big failure. The Wii, big success. And so we see those flip-flopping of markets. And in what situations do we see this? Again, during the workshop, we're going to analyze in more detail where we can expect ecosystems to really matter as opposed to just regular supply chains. And so we're going to talk about what we call network effects and experience effects. So when we talk about network effects, just to give you an illustration, host complements, we already talked about that. So it's the famous iPad and iTunes, or it's the console and the game. Install base, it's like with Google. I use Google because so many other people use Google. And why do so many other people use Google? Because so many products are available. It's customer install base, as we call it. We see the same phenomenon with what we call experience effects. And so, for instance, when the trial cost of a product or the trial time is very high, like for instance with ERP systems, enterprise resource planning systems, what do we notice is that decision makers tend to be very risk averse. They look what other people are doing, and they look not at other companies because they're stupid, but they look because they're risk averse. And again, what happened in the past really matters. And so we're going to explore in more detail during the workshop in what settings do we have to expect this success breeds success and failure breeds failure phenomenon to work. So we're going to identify, but it comes down to those 4 characteristics that I've put down there, but coming down to network effects and experience effects. And in those markets, what do we have? Market share really matters. And so it's not just your current market share, but even more importantly, your expected market share. If everybody thinks you're going to be a winner, it becomes like a self-sustaining process. Now, if everybody thinks that you're going to be a loser, nobody wants to try your product. And so it's those expectations that really matters. And so what we're going to do, again, during the workshop, I'm going to illustrate how we do market research. If you say, do I have a shot at market leadership in one of these markets, in one of those systems, how do I find out? How do I do market research if I launch a new product? And one of the things that we do is we try to poll the adoption intention of customers when they shop for new products. And so we're going to look at some of these graphs, as you see here, in for instance, game consoles. And on the vertical axis, we have the share of people that say, when I look at this Kindle versus the iPad, I think I would be ready to buy this if, for instance, here on the horizontal axis, 10 to 15% of the market were to buy a Kindle. And so this market data shows here that 4% of the market, for instance in France, would be willing to buy a Kindle if they expect that 10 to 15% of the market would expect a Kindle. So what we try to do is we try to read the mind of the customer, and on the basis of what customers are saying, we're trying to construct what is called the critical mass curve. Okay. And again, we don't have the time to go into the detail right now of how we do this, but so we construct this, we do this market research, and we try to get into the mind of the customers. What we typically see is that you have people that are the eager beavers. So for instance here there is one person that said, or one share of the market that says, I would already buy a Kindle if only 5 to 10% of the customers would have a Kindle. So these are typically, the tech leaders in a market. Vice versa, here on the other side, what do we have? We have a bunch of people that say, I would only buy a Kindle if pretty much 90 to 95% of the market has already a Kindle. So, and on the basis of this data, we try to construct what we call critical mass curves. Again, we don't have the time to go into detail right now. Let me just quickly jump ahead a little bit because I'm eating into my time right now. Let me just, so we construct what we call those critical mass curves. And to just give you a little bit of an intuition of what is going on is, for instance here, if 60% of the market say, I would buy this product, for instance a console, if what happens, if the most reluctant person expects to see only 50% to buy, what do we notice is that 60% is buying if they expect 50% to buy. What are we going to notice? we're going to see a positive or a success breeds success phenomenon occurring. We're only going to discuss, also going to discuss on the basis of this data, when we're going to see a failure breeds failure phenomenon occurring, and then we're going to illustrate this mechanism on the basis of actual data. And so without going into a lot of details, I'm just trying to give you a flavor of how we're going to discuss this topic. Of course, not just looking at the theory, but also then looking at the actual results from analysis and market research. And so this is here a critical mass curve, as we call it, from when Sony launched its PlayStation 3 against Xbox 360. And so, for instance, what does it show? It shows that 60% of the customers that were polled were willing to buy a PlayStation 3 when they expected 50% of the market to buy a PlayStation 3. So in other words, more people are actually willing to buy for a lower expected market share. And so this critical mass curve, as we call it, is above the equilibrium line. And what do we have above this point of critical mass? We're going to explain all of this. What happens? Success breeds success above this point, and below it, it's failure breeds failure. I realize full well that, of course, I cannot hope that I have conveyed all the details of this, but hopefully I've been able to give you a little bit of a flavor of what, sorry, it's going in the wrong direction, a flavor of what ecosystems and competing in ecosystems is really different from classic competition and supply chains. Many things are important, but one of the key things is understanding critical mass dynamic, and when does it matter. As we said, those network and experience products. When we have this, what do we know? Most people are losers, and it's not easy at all, even for the most experienced winners, to reach critical mass. Look at eBay, look at Intel. So how to get critical mass? Not a walk in the park. So what do? We really collect information, we try to visualize the market, and we try to get an understanding of what shot do we have at reaching critical mass. So we get into this data, and then we try to understand what is it going to take to jumpstart our product and get to robustness. And so when we're together at this workshop, these are the topics we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss, of course, the theory, but very, very importantly, we're going to discuss, of course, the application. Now, I realize that I've taken probably not 35 minutes, Ali, but I've taken 40 minutes, and I apologize for going a little bit over time. But so I'm very happy to take questions right now.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Quite an interesting one. Folks, now we're open for the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, or you could put your questions in the chat box, and I'll be happy to read them over on your behalf. So two options: either you could raise your hand, there's a hand icon on your webinar console, or you could put in the chat box. I see a raise hand already, so let me try to move to the person. Mr. Naveed Khwaja, you've raised your hand, sir. Could you please introduce yourself and ask the question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Naveed Khwaja. I'm a management consultant from the UK, specializing in agile and lean transformation services. So, Dr. Karel Cool, the ecosystems and the supply chain comparison that you gave around the middle of your presentation, I feel that there is a gap in understanding how the consulting firms can utilize these patterns and come up with a kind of an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any case study or any kind of research that you've done in this area?
In terms of consulting firms, so
Yes.
application to consulting firms, not to the practice. So you're talking about yourself, consulting firms rather than your clients.
Yes.
Okay. Critical mass is in fact very important to consulting companies, and you probably very much remember the drama that happened with Arthur Andersen. What took probably 40, 50 years to construct was undone in the span of 1 year. And this was a dramatic illustration of what we call failure breeds failure and success breeds success. We saw the same thing with Spicer Oppenheim, and we've seen now in very recent times the dramatic unraveling of the consulting company of Michael Porter called Monitor. And why do we have this? Of course, if you are a CEO and you're trying to decide what consulting company am I going to use to help me construct my strategy, you're of course very risk averse because it's your life, it's the life of the company that is at stake. If you make the wrong decision, it's really dramatic. And so this is one illustration of situations where companies are very risk averse and managers are very risk averse because the trial cost and the trial time is so high. How do I know I've chosen the right consultant? When do I know? After the fact. And so what is so very important is, of course, reputation for consultants. How do you establish your reputation? You establish your reputation by demonstrating what clients you've worked with and how successful those clients have been. And so you all like to have some very important lead clients. And so if you have those lead clients, of course, other firms come because the lead clients is there, and other firms are coming because the firms are there that came for the lead clients. Of course, it also works, in other words, success breeds success. What else is the case is that when some of those lead clients leave you, of course, many other firms are going to leave you because the lead clients leave you. And so that was what happened with Arthur Andersen. When Coke and IBM and some of the key lead clients left Arthur Andersen, of course, immediately 100 other firms left them because other firms were leaving. And so you had the failure breeds failure system or dynamic that set itself in motion. And so for your activities, your consulting is very much an area where critical mass matters, number one. Number two is, of course, so it's install-based critical mass, very, very important. Second, of course, what you have then also is your clients are going to try to understand if you are really capable to build ecosystems for them. So in other words, if an eBay were to come to you for advice, they're going to try to understand if you are able to build ecosystems or if you were able to build ecosystems for other clients. And so we have critical mass and ecosystems working in two ways. It is important for your reputation, number one. Number two, are you able to build ecosystems for your clients? And that is going to feed back into your own reputation. So I'm not sure I've been able to make or answer your question, but so I very much think that for consultants, this is a really, really important topic. Did I answer your question?
Yes, I do get this reputation and helping the ecosystem for the clients and making sure that success breeds success, and we have big names and lead clients to help us breed that success. I think what I was actually asking for was anything to do, as Seth Godin said in his
Excuse me, I didn't hear that. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Could you repeat this?
Sorry. So I was actually hinting towards more of Seth Godin's concept of tribes. I have a feeling there is a kind of a combination coming up where the supply chains and the ecosystems are going to combine through people, through mass media, through social critical mass.
Yes.
What do you think about the social media aspect of these things, or social interactions?
Thank you for raising this issue, because of course it brings up the whole point of open innovation, brings up the point of networks of people, and so this whole open innovation is again trying to put systems together of consultants and companies. The social media aspect extremely important, and again you have a very important network aspect to this. Thank you for raising this issue, because this is indeed a very important third leg in the whole discussion of ecosystems. And what is amazing about it is that those effects go faster and faster. You know, once big winners, if they cannot latch on to the new dynamic, really fall out of the boat so very quickly. And I think we all know examples of consulting companies, but you look in accounting and auditing, how fast it has been consolidating, and strategy consulting, and I think indeed a lot has to do with this very fast broadening to open systems and social networking.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Naveed. Let's move to the chat box. There are a few other questions. There's a question from the brother asking, what are the vulnerabilities in open system as compared to the closed systems?
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good question, of course. Let me start. The best of all worlds, if you're winning, is of course a closed system. You look at Nintendo, and so what has been the amazing success of Nintendo when we go back to Nintendo 64, I'm sorry, they were making money both on the console and on the tape, on the cartridge. And so they were able to make money on both ends. What is the difficulty with closed system is that you need to be able to provide both an excellent host and lots of complements, which is very investment intensive to be able to do this. You really need to shoulder the entire investment of both the host and the complement and reaching critical mass. What is the advantage of open systems? Like we see with Android, you make the system available, and immediately, or with Wi-Fi, immediately there are so many people that see an interest in joining that ecosystem and offering Wi-Fi routers, Wi-Fi whatever it is, and try to make some money. So it's much more easy to build an ecosystem. What is the difficulty, of course? Well, if it's open, how are you going to make money? And so it's not the first time that we've seen this, but so for instance with open software, Linux, how on earth can you make money with Unix System 5? Well, if the software is available, well, somehow you got to be able to sell services to help somebody install open software. So you must find a different mousetrap. And so it's more easy, I think, in many ways, to get people on the bandwagon. It is more difficult to make money. And then another difficulty with open systems is it's more and more difficult to get discipline, because then how do you keep this coalition together? So it unravels a lot more easily, those open systems. So it's a brilliant question. Lots of discussions going on that, and I've done in fact quite a bit of work, but I think the best of all worlds is a closed system. That's quite clear. But it's tremendously investment intensive. Open systems, more easy to get those critical mass dynamics going, but defection is more difficult, and you need to have a different business model. So you need to have a complement to make money. Just to give you an idea, when Sony launched, they made money by just a royalty on the games. they could only make money if they sold at least 100 million consoles. That was in the mid-90s. That had never been done before. The most successful console ever, Nintendo, they sold at the time 30 million consoles. So Sony had to sell 3 times as many consoles and make money from a small royalty on all the games that were out there to really break even. So very different model to make money, huge challenge. Did I answer this question? At least there are many more angles, but at least here are a couple of angles.
Yeah, I think it was quite elaborative. Let's move to another question from Brother Mansha. My question is, what impact does ecosystem have done in Nokia's case, where you place Nokia on critical dynamic cure in current scenario? Nokia is facing tough competition from smartphone manufacturers like Apple and Samsung.
Mm-hmm. Yes. During the workshop, we're going to discuss several factors. We're going to look at market factors that make entry and exit faster in markets and that makes leaders more vulnerable. And one of those characteristics is what we call market turnover or customer turnover. And just let me give the intuition. You look at some products like cigarettes. People start smoking cigarettes at one point in time, and they keep on smoking cigarettes for the next 20, 30 years. Cigarette manufacturers have a what we call a slow customer turnover, meaning customers stay in the market for a long time. You look at products like smoking cessation aids, like patches, that people use, nicotine patches. You use this for maybe 1 year, and what happens, either it works and you're no longer a customer for that product, or it doesn't work and you go back to smoking. And so sellers for nicotine patches need to get new customers all the time. And this phenomenon, so markets with low customer turnover, we call them very stable markets, because customers are in the market for a long time and it's more easy to develop loyalty. If you have markets with fast customer turnover, it's very difficult to keep leadership in the market, because new customers come in and out all the time. So you need to grab new customers all the time. Now, why do I start with this? It turns out that the markets for mobile phones and smartphones are more and more looking like markets for nicotine patches rather than for cigarettes. It used to be we were very loyal clients for telephones, and we stayed with them for a long time. Now with smartphones, there is more and more a tendency to go in and out from brands to the other. And so even if you are a leader, you're never sure that you're going to be able to build on the loyalty of your customers, because customers come in and out of the market so very quickly. So that's point number one. Point number two, if you're late in those markets, number one, and on top of it, you don't have the right product, meaning not just a phone, but a system of host and complements. It's not about the phone. In fact, the first iPhone I thought was a lousy phone. It really didn't have a good reception, but it had great complements. Okay. Now, if you're late in developing a system in the markets where customers increasingly come in and out very quickly, it really is, you're sitting on dynamite. And I think Nokia didn't really see this explosion coming. I think they didn't appreciate the situation very well. Now they're in good company, because of course Research in Motion or from Blackberry, of course, didn't see it coming either. And by the way, of course, the same thing can happen to Apple. There's absolutely nobody is immune to those shifts. But I think Apple has been playing this for a much longer time. They've experienced how difficult it can be, If you're losing, of course, go back to the 90s, and they're more aware of this, okay? Because in computers, we've seen this already for a long time, and the phones, it's a much more recent situation. So, yes, no, Nokia, very difficult. Don't count it because it's not just critical mass, it's market dynamic and critical mass together.
Okay, so are we ready for the next question? There is
Sure.
a question from Brother Tahir Imran. If we are unable to find the reaching critical mass, what is the effect in this failure on the business?
It's quite dramatic. If you're not able to reach critical mass, so there are either of two things that you can do. During the workshop, we're going to discuss quite extensively what you do when you fall off your horse. In other words, you launch a product, you think it's great, yet customers are not buying it. Now, it could be that it's simply not a good product, so you were wrong, and then, of course, answer is simple, retire your product, redesign it, start all over. Now, if it turns out that it is a good product, but you don't get this optimism, this momentum in the market, what kind of strategies do we have? And during the workshop, we're going to discuss what we call the 9 generic strategies to jumpstart the market. So in other words, I'm going to try to make people buy even though they may think that it's not a good product, or not a good product that it's not going to sell. And let me give an example. One of the difficulties that Sony had when they started with the PlayStation was, well, everybody has a Nintendo machine. How can I convince anybody to buy a PlayStation? Well, they were very smart. What they did was, the first PlayStation was the cheapest CD player in the world. The PlayStation 2 was the cheapest DVD player in the world. PlayStation 3 was the cheapest Blu-ray player in the world. And what they did was they subsidized the PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, but with a particular twist. They said to customers, well, I know you're hesitant, but even if you think that the PlayStation is not going to sell, you're still going to have the cheapest CD player in the world. Even if you think that PlayStation 2 is not going to catch on with the game developers, you still have the cheapest DVD player in the world. Even though you think that PlayStation 3 is not going to catch on with the game developers, you still have the cheapest Blu-ray player in the world. And so this is one of the strategies that we're going to discuss. If you really have headwinds in markets, how can you still launch your product? If it's bad, redesign, of course. If you don't get the adoption, it's not the end of the world. How do I redesign? How do I relaunch? And so that's one of the things we're going to discuss. Do I answer your question?
Sure, I guess since it was a chat question, I hear yes also from the brother.
Okay.
There's another sort of interesting one. How is crowdsourcing shaping up in complementing open systems in regards to supply chain efficiency?
Yeah. Crowdsourcing is of course a new word of something that has been going on in some industries for quite some time. And let me just give an example of this. For instance, you may be familiar with a French company called Hermès, the designer of luxury products, of course. In their development of new scarves, the development of new ties, and development of new products in general, what they do is they have competitions in the population of artists, and any artist in the world can submit their design to have the next best tie or scarf or whatever it is. And so they have been doing crowdsourcing for a long, long time to really develop the best designs. Now, of course, if you are an artist, with what company would you like to see your design win? You want to see your design win with very successful companies. Now, as a successful company, what designs would you want to have? You want to have the design of very successful artists and maybe of the new kid on the block. And so what do we have? Crowdsourcing is another example of success breeds success. So if you are really of significant reputation, you're going to be able to source the crowds quite a bit in terms of new ideas, new innovations, new products. And to the extent you're successful, you're going to get many ideas. To the extent you have many ideas, you're going to be able to tap many ideas. And thank you, in fact, for raising this question. Crowdsourcing is another illustration of what the first participant was asking about social networks. So many things mesh together, but it's again another illustration of where ecosystems are really becoming so important. So thanks for raising this issue. Crowdsourcing, very, very relevant in this debate.
And so we'll just take a last short question.
Yes.
RIM and its Blackberry are at crossroads in 2013. Can RIM recover?
Yes. So I don't know if you have your money down to invest in the stock markets now. It's going to be extremely difficult, I think. It's going to be extremely difficult for RIM to get back. And I think for various reasons. RIM used to have a lock on the professional market, on the business market. What we've seen is that, of course, the iPhone has really come into the business market and has become very, very accepted. Security used to be an issue, and Apple has been able to overcome this, number one. Number two, we have, of course, a combination of Nokia and Microsoft, and Microsoft having a classic link to the business community. So they're making a concerted effort in that regard too. So we have an accepted solution, a new coming solution, and BlackBerry in the mass market has an extremely hard time, of course, because there they have to compete with both Apple and with Android in the cheaper end of the market. So you look at the space that they have to come back, or to come back fast, and so it sounds like they have a niche environment, but having a niche environment in markets with critical mass is very complicated, extremely complicated, of course, because to get the success-based success is going to be in a very small part of the market. And it doesn't mean that they cannot survive in that small part of the market. For instance, Apple did this during the 90s and early 2000s when they were able to hang on to the graphic artists that relied on Apple for their development of publicity, etc. So they hang on to this very small ecosystem. But it's a very, very fickle situation, and I think there are so many alternatives, and good alternatives now, to research in motion, and I'm not trying to badmouth them. I'm sure they have a good product, but I find it a little late and with a lot of competition in their classic market. So having said that, I wish them the best. This is my my final word on that.
Okay. Well, that brings us towards the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. Karel Cool, for your time and sharing this valuable information with our participants. And thank you all those who participated. Please be informed that Dr. Karel Cool will be coming to Madinah to conduct a workshop full day on the same topic, leadership, how to gain leadership market in the ecosystems. During PALM 5, which is a program for advanced leadership and management. I have posted the URL link for the program registration. We are still open for enrollments. You can learn more about the program. It's a 2-week program, and Dr. Cool is going to be one of our distinguished speakers in this program. So Dr. Karel Cool, once again, thank you very much for your time.
It's been my great pleasure to be able to interact with very esteemed clients, and I very much look forward to meeting them during the workshop.
Definitely. And folks, with that, before I conclude, please do tune to our website www.mile.org to learn more about our upcoming programs and the webinars. There's a webinar on 27th from Dr. Rizwan Sheikh, who's Professor Associate Dean for KSBL in collaboration with Cambridge Judge Business School. The topic is, can you tell your corporate strategy? What is it? And then you can always join our Mile community. It's community.mile.org to interact with numerous subject experts and gain access to the content. We are recording these webinars. We have been lagging in bit updating our archives, but now we have a archive management system developed for webinars, and all of them will be uploaded on our community. So please do join the community.